The smell of burning rubber and gasoline hung heavy in the air, a sharp contrast to the quiet golden light of the early morning. Christabel didn't look like a hero. Dressed in a sweat-stained, faded shirt and a simple headwrap, she stood on the deserted asphalt, her eyes wide as she stared at the skeletal remains of a crushed luxury sedan. The car's hood was buckled like crumpled paper, and the windshield was a spiderweb of shattered glass. Any other person would have kept walking to avoid the trouble, but Christabel couldn't. Behind her eyes was the face of her brother, Evans, whose life was already tethered to a hospital machine. She saw a life slipping away, not just a wreck. With a strength born of years of hard labor and carrying heavy loads, she yanked open the jammed driver's side door. Inside, slumped over the steering wheel, was a man who looked like royalty even in his broken state. His skin was pale, a thin trickle of blood running from his temple down his sharp, smooth jawline. Christabel didn't know his name was Matthew Adelai, or that he held the keys to a billion-dollar empire. She only knew he was breathing faintly. With a grunt of effort, she dragged his heavy frame from the seat just as the first flicker of orange flame licked the engine block. She laid him flat on the cool road, his head cradled against her lap, shaded from the mounting heat. For a fleeting second, his eyes flew open, wild, unfocused, and searching. He reached out, his trembling fingers catching the hem of her worn shirt, and pulled her close. "Don't leave me," he whispered, his voice a ragged ghost of a sound. The vulnerability in his voice pierced through Christabel's defensive shell, making her heart skip a beat. She watched his lips tremble as he fought for consciousness, his shirt soaked in the sweat of agony. "I'm here, sir. Just breathe." "Big man, breathe," she urged, her own chest thudding with a mixture of terror and adrenaline. She touched his neck again, the warmth there gave her a sliver of hope. She looked at his face properly for the first time, noting the neat cut of his hair and the expensive glint of a wristwatch that her dreams could never afford. This was a man of power, yet here he was, reduced to a desperate plea on a lonely stretch of road. Then his hand dropped, his grip loosening as he slipped back into the darkness. Christabel froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. She looked left and right. The road was still empty, and the security posts of the nearby estates were far too distant to hear her cry for help. Fearing the arrival of authorities who might mistake her rescue for a crime, or the sudden explosion of the hissing vehicle, she bit her finger in a moment of sharp panic. She knew the world often blamed the poor for the tragedies of the rich. Gently, she laid his head back down on the asphalt. She took one last, cautious look at the man who had just anchored his survival to her presence. "You better wake up, big man," she muttered under her breath, brushing the dust of the road from her clothes. She grabbed her few belongings and turned away, her slippers slapping against the pavement. She disappeared into the rising sun, unaware that those 3 whispered words had just rewritten the rest of her life, and that she was leaving behind a billionaire who would soon turn the city upside down to find his barefoot angel. If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family, and tell us where you're watching from in the comment section. Now, let's continue. The sterile scent of antiseptic and the rhythmic hollow beep of a heart monitor were the first things to greet Matthew Adelai as he clawed his way back from the abyss. His eyelids felt like they were weighted with lead, and his head throbbed with a rhythmic, pulsing fire that mirrored the machine surrounding him. For a long moment, he didn't know who he was or how he had arrived in this cold, white room where the lights burned too brightly against his retinas. Then the memories hit him like the crash itself, the screech of tires, the smell of gasoline, and the crushing weight of the steering wheel against his chest. But through the fog of pain, one image remained sharper than the rest, a face framed by a simple headwrap, eyes filled with a fierce burning light that demanded he live. When he finally managed to croak out a sound, his throat felt as though it were filled with dry sand. A nurse rushed to his side, but Matthew didn't want water or medicine. He wanted answers. He remembered the feeling of rough, calloused fingers against his neck and the sound of a voice, sharp, blunt, and strangely comforting, telling him to breathe. He remembered a pair of mismatched slippers disappearing into the morning mist and a whispered plea that he had made in his final moments of lucidity. "The girl," he whispered hoarsely, clutching the nurse's arm with a strength that surprised them both. "The one who pulled me out. Where is she?" The medical staff exchanged confused glances, telling him he had been found alone by a passing motorist minutes after the wreck, but Matthew knew better. He could still feel the phantom pressure of her hands on his ribs, performing a frantic, unpolished rhythm of CPR that had dragged his soul back into his body. He was the CEO of United Holdings, a man used to barking instructions and having the world bend to his will, but in that wreck, he had been nothing but a dying man saved by a stranger who asked for no reward. By the time Dennis, his loyal assistant, arrived with a face pale from worry, Matthew was already trying to sit up, ignoring the sharp protest of his bandaged ribs. He didn't ask about the company's stock price or the state of his Mercedes. He grabbed Dennis by the collar of his suit. "Someone saved me, Dennis. A girl. She looked like she had nothing, but she gave me back my life and just walked away." Dennis tried to soothe him, suggesting it was a hallucination brought on by the trauma, but Matthew's obsession only flared brighter. He described her with a vividness that bordered on the sacred: the dirt on her cheek, the torn shirt, and the nylon sack she dragged behind her like a discarded treasure. He ordered Dennis to pull every scrap of CCTV footage from the estate roads near the crash site and to check every recycling hub in the city. He wasn't looking for a socialite or a doctor. He was looking for a barefoot angel who smelled of sweat and honesty. As he stared out the hospital window at the sprawling city of Lagos, Matthew felt a strange shift in his soul. He had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted his name or his bank account, but this girl had seen him at his most broken and wanted nothing but for him to keep breathing. He whispered her whispered promise back to the empty room, a silent vow that he would find her, no matter how many dusty roads he had to search. The search for the barefoot angel led Dennis through the gritty underbelly of the city, far from the polished marble of United Holdings. He didn't find her in a registry or a database. He found her through the trail of a single discarded bottle of malt that had fallen from her sack during the rescue. By tracing the batch code to a small recycling shop near a Ghanian, Dennis finally spotted the woman who had become Matthew's obsession. She was squatting beside a green estate bin, her mismatched slippers worn thin, her movements filled with a quiet, practiced dignity that seemed to defy her ragged surroundings. When the black SUVs pulled up, Christabel didn't flinch. She stood her ground with her head held high, even as she clutched her nylon sack like a shield. She was wary, fearing she was being arrested for the mouth-to-mouth she had performed on the road, but Dennis assured her that his boss simply wanted to return the life she had saved. Driven by a sense of duty to her brother Evans, Christabel eventually agreed to enter the sprawling Adelai mansion, a place of expensive silence and gold frames that felt like another planet. She stood in the center of the massive living room, still wearing her faded shirt with the hole near the waist, looking Matthew Adelai directly in the eye without a shred of intimidation. Matthew, now recovered but wearing a look of deep exhaustion, didn't offer a simple reward of cash. He looked at her calloused hands and the fire in her eyes and saw the only person who could help him fulfill a heavy burden. He explained that his mother, Mama Matthew, was fading like morning dew, and her final desperate wish was to see him married to someone real, someone not blinded by his bank account. The proposal Matthew laid out was a cold, calculated contract, a one-year marriage to satisfy a dying woman's peace of mind. In exchange, every kobo of Evans' mounting hospital bills would be paid, and the surgery that seemed like a distant miracle would become a reality. Christabel felt a sharp laugh bubble up in her throat at the absurdity of it, a trash picker becoming the wife of a billionaire, but the laughter died when she thought of Evans' weak breathing and the nurses who whispered that he wouldn't last the month. She looked at the luxury surrounding her and then at her own stained fingers, realizing that this madness was the only bridge to her brother's survival. "I'll do it," she said, her voice small but steady, cutting through the hum of the air conditioner. She made it clear she wasn't doing it for the marble floors or the status. She was doing it for the only family she had left in the world. Matthew nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face, though he knew he was asking her to step into a cage of lies. Christabel had one condition: she would not pretend to be someone she wasn't. She would enter this house as herself, the woman who knew the value of a discarded bottle and the weight of a heavy sack. As they shook hands to seal the deal, Christabel felt the world tilt on its axis. She walked over to the corner of the room and dropped her dirty nylon bag into the dustbin, signaling the end of one life and the beginning of a charade that felt dangerously close to a sacrifice. The transition from the dusty streets to the cold, echoing grandeur of the Adalai mansion felt like stepping into a dream that Christabel wasn't sure she wanted to dream. As she followed Danis through the towering mahogany doors, the sheer scale of the wealth hit her with the weight of an iron curtain. Her mismatched slippers, though she had scrubbed them, felt like an insult to the pristine marble floors that stretched out like a frozen lake. Christabel clutched her small bundle of belongings, mostly things for Evans, feeling the sharp sting of the sacrifice she was making. She wasn't here for the gold frames or the scent of expensive silence. She was here because the hospital bills for Evans were chasing her like devils, and Matthew Adalai was the only shield she had left. Matthew awaited her in a living room that looked more like a museum than a home, his presence commanding yet shadowed by the grief of his mother's condition. He watched her enter with a mixture of relief and guilt, seeing the fire in her eyes that hadn't been extinguished by the intimidating surroundings. There was no warmth in their initial greeting, only the heavy air of a business transaction. Christabel made it clear from the onset. She would not pretend to be a socialite, and she would not forget the dirt under her fingernails. She was a woman who had carried bags of trash heavier than most men, and she brought that same grit into the world of marble and gold. Moving into the guest wing was a surreal ordeal. The bed was softer than anything she had ever touched, yet it felt like a trap. She spent her first night staring at the ornate ceiling, her mind drifting to the sterile hospital ward where Evans lay fighting for every breath. The contract sat on a nearby mahogany table, a piece of paper that traded her freedom for her brother's heart surgery. It was a heavy price, but as she looked at her calloused hands in the dim light of the designer lamps, she knew she would do it 1,000 times over to hear Evans laugh again. The sacrifice extended beyond just her living arrangements. It was the erasure of her anonymity. She had spent years being invisible to the estate residents, a ghost in a yellow shirt, but now she was the center of a billionaire's carefully constructed lie. Every servant who bowed to her and every meal served on silver platters reminded her of the distance between her past and this gilded present. She felt like an intruder in her own life, a trash picker wearing the invisible crown of a billionaire's wife, waiting for the one wrong move that could shatter the fragile peace she had bought for her brother. The transition from the cold grandeur of the living room to the hushed sanctity of Mama Matthew's bedroom felt like entering the very heart of the Adalai mansion's secrets. Christabel walked with a softness she didn't know she possessed, her bare feet silent on the floor as she followed Matthew toward the flickering light of a bedside lamp. The room smelled of lavender and medicine, a heavy scent that reminded Christabel of the hospital hallways where she had spent so many desperate nights praying for Evans. Mama Matthew lay against a mountain of white pillows, her frame frail and thin like paper, but her eyes, still bright with a fading fire, searched for Christabel as they entered. Matthew took his mother's hand, his voice thick with a vulnerability he only ever showed in this room. When he introduced Christabel, the lie felt like a heavy stone in her throat, yet seeing the pure, unfiltered relief wash over the old woman's face made the stone soften. Mama Matthew reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched Christabel's calloused hand, and for a moment, the world of marble and gold vanished. Christabel didn't see a billionaire's mother. She saw a woman who simply wanted to know her son wouldn't be alone when the sun finally set on her life. The priest arrived as the evening shadows lengthened across the floor, his presence bringing a solemnity that made the air feel thick. There was no crowd, no cameras, and no grand decorations, just the quiet hum of the oxygen machine and the flickering candles. Christabel was dressed in a simple white lace gown that felt light against her skin, a far cry from a yellow shirt she had worn when she first dragged Matthew from the wreckage. As the ceremony began, the words of the vows hung in the air, echoing with a weight that Christabel hadn't anticipated. When Matthew slid the ring onto her finger, his hand was steady, but his eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "In sickness and in health," the priest intoned, and Christabel's mind flashed to Evans in his hospital bed and then back to the dying woman smiling weakly at her. She realized then that while the marriage was a contract, the promise she was making to this mother was real. She was vowing to be the peace this family lacked. When it was her turn to speak, her voice didn't shake. She looked at Matthew, not as a billionaire, but as the man who had whispered, "Don't leave me in the wreckage," and she meant the words of comfort she offered. As they were pronounced man and wife, Mama Matthew clapped her hands softly, a small triumphant sound in the quiet room. Matthew leaned in, his lips brushing Christabel's cheek in a gesture that was supposed to be for show, yet the warmth of it lingered long after he pulled away. In that moment, surrounded by the scent of lavender and the presence of death, the lie started to bleed into something that felt dangerously like truth. Christabel realized she was no longer just a trash picker playing a part. She was a woman tied to a man by a whispered promise and a sacred vow, and the lines of their agreement were beginning to blur in the shadows of the bedside lamps. The sun had barely begun to fall like a tired orange flame behind the trees of the estate when the long-expected silence finally claimed the room. Mama Matthew passed away with a final serene smile still resting on her lips, her hand going cold in Matthew's grip. For nearly 10 minutes, Matthew did not move or blink. He simply sat there, his eyes fixed on her face as if waiting for her to wake up and tell him she was only joking. But the machines had stopped their rhythmic chirping, and the only sound left in the mansion was the heavy, suffocating weight of grief. Christabel stood at the threshold, her bare feet silent on the marble floor as she watched the man who had always seemed like an untouchable tower of power begin to crumble. Matthew's jaw tightened, and his chest rose in a sharp, jagged motion before his composure finally cracked open like glass. He broke completely, letting out a sharp, ragged gasp that quickly dissolved into deep, gut-wrenching sobbing. It wasn't the quiet, refined grief of a billionaire. It was the raw, unbridled weeping of a little boy who had just lost his mother and realized that all the money in his bank accounts couldn't buy her back for even a second. Christabel didn't offer empty words or platitudes. She simply walked to him and sat on the floor beside his chair. When she placed her hand quietly on his back, he didn't shrug her off. Instead, he turned and collapsed into her arms, burying his face in her shoulder as if she were the only solid thing left in a world that had just turned into water. Her lace gown got soaked with his tears, and her arms went numb from the weight of him, but she didn't move. She held him with a fierce, quiet strength, realizing that in this moment of absolute truth, she wasn't a trash picker and he wasn't a tycoon. They were just two souls bonded by a shared loss and a whispered promise in the dark. As the professionals arrived to carry Mama Matthew's body out, Matthew watched every second with a haunting intensity, memorizing the way they zipped the bag and covered her face for the last time. Christabel stayed by his side through the entire ordeal, never leaving him even as dawn began to bleed through the curtains. By the time the morning light touched the room, Matthew's eyes were swollen red, and his voice was a mere shadow of itself. He sat with her on the grand staircase, a cup of water untouched in his hand. "You didn't even get a chance to grieve her properly," Christabel whispered, her voice soft against the echoing silence of the hall. Matthew shook his head slowly, admitting that he had been too busy pretending to be okay for the cameras and the contract. Christabel leaned her head against the mahogany banister, looking at him with the fire in her eyes, softened by empathy. She told him he didn't have to pretend with her, that here, behind the closed gates of the Audley mansion, he was allowed to be broken. When Matthew turned to her and asked if she would still leave now that the reason for their contract was gone, Christabel felt a pang of something real and dangerous in her chest. She looked away, thinking of Evans and the surgery that was now guaranteed, but when she looked back at Matthew's shattered face, she knew her answer. She told him she wouldn't leave yet, not because of the money or the marble, but because he needed someone to help him breathe again after the storm. Something heavy and undeniable passed between them in that moment, a truth that no contract could have predicted and no lie could fully contain. The peace that had begun to settle over the Audley mansion after the funeral was shattered by the rhythmic, aggressive clicking of 6-inch heels against the marble foyer. The morning rain was still tapping against the glass when the front doors swung open without an invitation, admitting a woman who carried herself like a storm wrapped in designer silk. Myrable, Matthew's ex-girlfriend, did not simply enter a room, she colonized it. Behind her, Dennis looked helpless, his face a mask of frustration as he tried to block her path, but she brushed past him with a crocodile smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was dragging a designer suitcase and wearing a dress so tight it seemed to emphasize the slight, dramatic swell of her belly. Christabel emerged from the dining room, still holding a cleaning cloth, her brow furrowed at the intrusion. She didn't need to be told who this woman was. The air in the room had curdled the moment Mirabel stepped inside. Mirabel stopped dead, her eyes scanning Christabel from her headwrap down to her bare feet with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Who is this?" Mirabel barked, her voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. Christabel didn't flinch. She stood her ground with the same fire she had used to face the estate guards. "I should ask you that," Christabel countered, her voice low and steady. "You're dripping water on my clean rug." The tension snapped when Matthew rushed down the stairs, his face pale as he took in the scene. "Mirabel, what are you doing here?" he demanded. She didn't answer with words at first. Instead, she placed a hand over her stomach in a gesture so rehearsed it felt like a scene from a bad soap opera. "I'm carrying your child, Matthew," she announced, her voice loud enough for every servant in the hallway to hear. The room froze. Christabel felt a sharp, cold spike of betrayal pierce through her chest, even though she knew their marriage was supposed to be a lie. She looked at Matthew, searching for a denial, but he was staring at Mirabel with a mixture of shock and disbelief. What Matthew didn't see was the shadow lurking near the gate. Andrew, his rival and Mirabel's secret collaborator. Andrew had coached Mirabel on every line, every tear, and every dramatic pause. His plot was simple: use a fake pregnancy to humiliate Matthew, destroy his new marriage to the trash picker, and create a scandal large enough to tank United Holdings stock. Andrew knew that if he could break Matthew's reputation, he could finally seize the empire Matthew had built. To the world, Mirabel was the heartbroken ex-lover. To Andrew, she was a Trojan horse designed to shatter the Audley legacy from the inside out. Mirabel began to weep, her mascara melting down her cheeks as she claimed that the stress of the crash and his secret wedding had nearly caused her to lose the baby. Christabel watched the performance with a narrowing gaze, her instincts, honed by years of surviving on the streets where everyone had a con, screaming that this was a trap. She saw the way Mirabel's eyes darted toward the hallway, checking to see if the staff were watching. Christabel dropped her cloth, the sound slapping against the floor like a challenge. "This is a lot of drama for someone who hasn't even shown us a medical report," Christabel noted sharply. Matthew stepped back, his hand raking through his hair. He hadn't seen Mirabel in months, and the timeline didn't make sense, but the weight of the accusation in front of Christabel felt like a mountain. Mirabel saw his hesitation and doubled down, reaching for his hand and sobbing about their future. Christabel didn't wait to hear the rest. She walked out of the room and into the garden, the rain soaking her hair as she tried to reconcile the man who had cried in her arms with a man who might have left a pregnant woman behind. Behind her, inside the mansion of marble and gold, the trap Andrew had set was closing its jaws, and for the first time since the rescue, Christabel felt like the world of the rich was far more dangerous than the dusty road she had left behind. The air inside the Audley mansion was heavier than pepper soup on an empty stomach, thick with a tension that threatened to suffocate everyone within its marble walls. Christabel stood by the hallway, her arms folded tightly under her chest and her eyes fixed on the parlor door, refusing to enter but listening with every nerve in her body alert. Inside, Mirabel sat on the edge of the velvet couch, fanning her fake lashes like a suffering widow while her red bodycon dress seemed to tighten with the weight of her own mounting guilt. Matthew paced the floor, his face a mask of cold stone, until the heavy front doors creaked open to admit Dennis. The assistant walked in like an undercover agent, silent and purposeful, carrying a large brown envelope that held the power of a final verdict. Without a word, Dennis handed the envelope to Matthew, who tore it open with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the technical jargon of the laboratory report. The silence in the room was so absolute it could have choked a goat. Matthew's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, a low, dangerous rumble like thunder before a catastrophic storm. He looked up slowly, his gaze pinning Mirabel to the silk cushions. "This child isn't mine, Mirabel," he said, the words cutting through her performance like a blade. Christabel, listening from the hallway, felt her heart thud with a sudden violent relief that nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. Mirabel blinked, her face pale as she reached for the paper, her hand shaking so much she nearly dropped it. As she read the words 0% probability, her eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. She began a frantic, incoherent defense, claiming the nurses were jealous or that the lab had used the wrong blood samples. But Danis stepped forward, his arms crossed over his chest, and countered her lies with cold facts. They had run 5 separate samples to ensure there was no margin for error. The trap Andrew had helped her build was collapsing, and in her desperation, Mirabel's tongue slipped, mentioning a name that turned the room to ice. Andrew. "You slept with Andrew?" Matthew asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. The truth finally spilled out, a messy, ugly confession of one drunken night and a plan to use the resulting pregnancy to trap Matthew and secure the Audley fortune for his rival. Mirabel began to cry for real then, but there was no pity left in the room. Her mascara melted faster than her excuses as Matthew's disgust turned into a cold, hard shield. He looked at her, noting that even now, she only cared about her pride and the empire she had failed to steal. Matthew's voice grew firm as he addressed the woman who had insulted his house and humiliated his wife. Christabel flinched at the word wife, the weight of it hitting her harder than any of Mirabel's lies. Danis didn't wait for further instructions. He stepped forward like a bouncer at closing time, picking up Mirabel's designer suitcase as if it were expired bread and showing her the way to the gate. She was led out into the fading light, defeated and smudged, as the gate closed behind her with the finality of karma. Inside, Christabel slowly walked into the parlor, her steps light but her presence loud in the sudden quiet. Matthew turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and a newfound softness that made her pulse quicken. He tried to speak her name, but she raised a hand, pointing toward the couch with a sharp, familiar authority. "Sit," she commanded, and for the first time in his life, the billionaire CEO obeyed without question, sitting like a student waiting for a report card. Christabel stared at him long and hard, the fire in her eyes burning with a truth that had nothing to do with contracts or money. She warned him that the next time someone walked into his house claiming to be a ghost from his past, he had better find his voice like a real man. Matthew could only nod, a silent promise forming between them that the lies were finally over. The morning sun broke over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the airport tarmac that felt like a benediction for the journey ahead. Christabel stood by the boarding stairs, her fingers laced tightly through those of her brother, Evans, who looked smaller than ever in his thick traveling jacket. This was the moment they had prayed for through years of dust and hunger, the flight to Germany for the specialized surgery that would finally fix his heart. Christabel sobbed openly as the medical team prepared to lift him, promising him ice cream for every single day of his recovery once he returned home. Evans, with a wisdom beyond his years, looked up at Matthew, who stood silently behind them, and whispered a final sharp command to not hurt his sister. Matthew didn't hesitate. He squeezed Christabel's shoulder and vowed to spend the rest of his life making sure he never did. As the plane ascended, carrying Christabel's heart and her brother's future toward the horizon, the heavy air of the Audley mansion began to lift, replaced by a clarity that no contract could have bought. The fire in her eyes remained, but the defensive ice that had once defined her interactions with Matthew had finally melted away in the wake of their shared trials. 1 week later, the estate was once again buzzing with rumors, but this time, the headlines weren't fueled by scandal or Mirabel's toxic lies. Matthew released a formal statement to the press, declaring that he was getting married to the woman who had not only saved his life but had taught him how to truly live it. There was no mention of a 1-year agreement or a dying wish. This time, there was only a truth that was loud, messy, and undeniable. The wedding was nothing like the hurried, somber ceremony held at a bedside. Christabel chose a gown herself, one that wasn't overly grand or encrusted with heavy jewels, but featured small silver stars that mirrored the ones she saw in Matthew's eyes when he smiled at her. Danis walked her down the aisle, his eyes glistening with the pride of an uncle as he led her toward the man who had once been a thunder victim slumped over a steering wheel. The entire mansion staff attended as honored guests, and a video feed from Germany showed a recovering Evans cheering from his hospital bed, screaming for his sister to marry him well. When the priest reached the final benediction and invited the groom to kiss his bride, Christabel didn't settle for a polite peck on the cheek. She kissed Matthew as if he were her very oxygen, and he held her like she was finally his piece. Later that night, the newlyweds retreated to the rooftop of the mansion, which had become Christabel's favorite place to escape the suffocating luxury of the lower floors. They sat on the ledge with mugs of hot chocolate, the cool breeze dancing around them as they watched the city lights twinkle like scattered diamonds. Matthew leaned back, a soft grin playing on his lips as he addressed her for the first time as Mrs. Adelai, asking her what her first act as Queen of the Empire would be. Christabel sipped her drink slowly, her bare feet swinging over the edge of the marble ledge. She joked that she would start by taking over his bank accounts, but then she leaned in and kissed his jaw, whispering that she had already found something far more valuable. The trash picker who had once dragged a nylon sack through the dust had become a queen, not because of the ring on her finger or the name on the marriage certificate, but because she had always possessed a royalty of spirit that wealth could never manufacture. It had taken a broken man, a car wreck, and a stubborn heart for the world to see what was always there. As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Christabel realized that the contract was dead, and in its place, a real story had begun, one written not in ink or gold, but in the breath they had given back to each other.